During the course of attempting to trace the origin of the ballroom photo seen in the final shot of The Shining, I was contacted in early 2012 by a fan of my work who emailed me a copy of a page found in a 1985 book called The Complete Airbrush and Photo Retouching Manual. This book presents what is apparently the unaltered version of the photo that we see in The Shining, with an odd-looking bald gentleman who is standing in a position where Jack is seen in the film version. This page raised a number of questions in my mind. Why are there so few bald men in the crowd, yet the one that Jack was superimposed over is the most bald of them all? Does the waving right hand of the man contain the small object, which is possibly a folded slip of paper that is seen in Jack's hand in the film version? Is this really the unaltered version of the photo, or had other people in the crowd already been altered in advance? Why does the article claim that the original photo was from 1923, which conflicts with Kubrick's claim that the photo was from 1921? There were a whole bunch of questions that came up, and sure, some of those questions would lead to nothing, and some of them might lead to something. Here is Kubrick's interview comments regarding the photograph. Interviewer Michael Simmons asked Kubrick, "Did you have all those extras posed for the last shot?" And Kubrick's response was, "No, they were in a photograph taken in 1921, which we found in a picture library. I originally planned to use extras, but it proved impossible to make them look as good as the people in the photograph. So I very carefully photographed Jack, matching the angle and the lighting of the 1921 photograph, and shooting him from different distances too, so that his face would be larger and smaller on the negative. This allowed the choice of an image size which, when enlarged, would match the grain structure in the original photograph. The photograph of Jack's face was then airbrushed into the main photograph, and I think the result looked perfect. Every face around Jack is an archetype of the period." End quote. Neither Kubrick nor the airbrushing manual state exactly where the photo came from, who is in the original photo, or where and when the photo was taken. The contradiction of Kubrick claiming that the original was taken in 1921 and the book claiming that it was taken in 1923 is still of particular interest to me. So either one of these sources has their facts wrong, which would more likely be the text of the airbrushing book, because it's unlikely that Kubrick would choose a 1923 photo and then allow the wrong date in a published interview. He typically screened the final text of his interviews before authorizing them for publication. Or alternately, disinformation has been supplied by Kubrick, resulting in the wrong year appearing in the airbrushing manual. Unfortunately, the airbrushing book gives us little in terms of verifiable facts. The photo could have been from 1921, 1923, or a completely different year. We don't know because the book doesn't tell us the exact source. Pursuing further information, I contacted the individual who had kindly forwarded me the scanned page from the airbrushing manual, and I asked him to check the bibliography of the book. It turned out that the airbrush artist cited for the ballroom photo job was Joan Smith. So I set about contacting her, which wasn't an easy task, as I had no other information to go on other than her name and the fact that she was an artist. Eventually I tracked her down via a colleague of hers, who had her listed as still running art classes in a small town in southern England. Eventually I spoke to her over the phone, and our discussion was fascinating. Joan Smith, who is now in her 80s, had an extensive career as a professional artist. Due to her reputation, Kubrick approached her to work on The Shining, a process which kept her involved for several months. Although my initial inquiry with Joan was only about the process of superimposing Jack into the ballroom photo, she enthusiastically supplied me with dozens of interesting and often hilarious anecdotal stories about her experiences of working with Stanley Kubrick. And we'll explore those anecdotes shortly. I attempted several times over the course of a year to arrange a video interview with Joan, but due to her age and the travelling distance between her hometown and my home in Liverpool and her commitments to care for a family member, I was unable to get the interview arranged. Instead, my reports of Joan's information are limited to notes that I had taken during my telephone conversations with her. Regarding the ballroom photo, Joan had little information to give and was unable to locate her original materials, as she said that they are stored somewhere among her own extensive back catalogue of artwork. She did not know the exact source of the original photo, but she stated that she vaguely recalled Stanley telling her that he'd acquired it from a BBC photo library. Now this is plausible because the BBC website today states that its photo library includes pictures dating back to the 1920s. This contrasts with the selection of photos surrounding the ballroom photo in the movie, which have been cited in one of the biographies of Kubrick as having been acquired from Warner Brothers photo archive. That was either the Vincent Labruto or John Baxter biography. I can't remember which one. It was definitely one of those. And that same biography also stated that these Warner Brothers photos were destroyed in a fire during the production of The Shining, which burned down the Colorado Lounge set where many of the pictures were being used as props. And yet, I was able to view those very same photos at the Stanley Kubrick archives over 30 years later. Now that's interesting, isn't it? The photos are reported by one biographer as having burned as part of the set, and yet there they are in the archives. I've seen them, I've been to the archives and looked at them. Joan explained that Stanley had her experiment with placing photos of Jack in a variety of positions in different parts of the ballroom photo, and then asked her in which position she believed it would be best to show Jack in the film. And she said that Jack should be at the very front of the picture and that Stanley agreed with her. Now, we'll probably never know whether this was what Stanley had in mind to begin with, but I will add that, having extensively read about his meticulousness in direction and having heard further evidence of that meticulousness from Joan herself, I personally think it's extremely unlikely that Stanley would simply hand over such a major decision to a minor crew member for what is arguably the film's most thematically important shot. Also, to place Jack anywhere else in the picture that would be off-centre, that would ruin the symmetry of this final shot. You couldn't have the camera go in with symmetry and then suddenly shift over to the side to Jack in a position that's not in the centre of the photo. That wouldn't look right visually, and I'm pretty sure that Stanley Kubrick knew that. Joan said that she was not asked to superimpose any other people into the ballroom photo, although this doesn't necessarily prove that it didn't happen. Kubrick often had multiple artists consecutively working on the same task without telling them what work had already been done or was going to be done by other artists. For example, the script for the movie AI was developed with multiple writers over many, many years, and most of those writers didn't find out until after the film was released, which other writers had also worked on that script. Joan also said that Stanley had attempted to stage a photo with real actors, but was not happy with the results, and this is supported by Kubrick's comments to Michael Simmons on the subject. Though it is notable that, as far as I can tell, neither Joan nor Michael Simmons actually were there to see Kubrick trying to do these photos with these extras. It may be that Kubrick all along knew that he wasn't going to use a staged photo and was always going to use an old photo from the BBC archives or wherever it came from. Aside from having Joan work on the ballroom photo, Kubrick allowed her to visit the Shining sets on multiple occasions to discuss her work in progress. Despite the multiple reports of Kubrick being difficult to work with on this particular production, Joan said that Stanley was always extremely courteous and polite. He would always stop what he was doing to talk to her, even if it meant interrupting a particular scene being shot. Upon her first visit to the studio, Kubrick was attempting to discuss the airbrushing work, but he noticed that Joan was too distracted by the sets to concentrate. So he told a colleague to take her around all the sets until her curiosity had been satisfied, and then they could continue their work-related discussions. So I'm now going to tell you about some of the stories that Joan gave me about her experiences of wandering around the sets on various days, and personally I found some of these stories hilarious. First up, unused horror shots in the Gold Room. Shots of the upper-class Gold Room crowd, shown as dead people, were filmed apparently. Jack was supposed to turn away from the bar mirror and see all this. Extras in tuxedos and gowns were drenched in blood, with knives stuck in many of their backs and heads. And among them were many skeletons, which we also see bathed in blue light and spider webs in the reception area in the released cut of the film. And apparently Kubrick absolutely insisted on real skeletons being used on set. He would not accept fakes. Next up, moose heads. Kubrick insisted on a real moose head prop being used in the film. He requested that 6 real ones be provided so that he could pick the one that he liked. But the props team said they could only find 1 moose head in Britain, but Kubrick insisted that more be found. So to appease him, they took photos of the same moose head against 6 backgrounds, pretending it was 6 props. Kubrick chose one of them, but it was eventually burned in the Colorado Lounge set fire. We do see one shot of the moose head in the film lurking in the background in a slow zoom shot of Jack glaring out the window. The emphasis of Kubrick in having aesthetic choices regarding the moose head may be because he wanted it to have a demonic appearance in relation to Jack's face. Next up, 360-degree performing. In shots such as the Gold Room crowd scene, Kubrick would have actors performing both in and out of the frame, even if it involved them being directly behind the camera crew. Next up, the treatment of Shelley Duvall and Scatman Crothers. Joan Smith's comments further support what is already evident in the making of the Shining documentary. Kubrick insulted Shelley Duvall repeatedly and told her she couldn't act and that she couldn't even be an actress. He kept her cold a lot of the time while everyone else on set was warm. And during dozens of takes of Crothers being axed to death, the actor was apparently freezing too. Next up, the chessboard assistant. Kubrick's custom of playing chess on set during production with anyone who was willing to play continued on the set of The Shining, but in this instance he even had an assistant whose job it was to carry around his chessboard from set to set, ensuring that the pieces were not disturbed mid-game. One person employed just to do that. Next up, the tennis ball. This one's interesting. Despite widely cited reports that Jack Nicholson improvised the throwing of the tennis ball, Joan Smith says that the young actor playing Danny Torrance was playing with a tennis ball, and Kubrick saw this and told crew members to film it before going on to include the tennis ball in other scenes. Interesting how we get different reports on these things. Not always easy to figure out which ones are true and which are false. Next up, helicopters and salt. At one point the crew were short of bags to bring in the tons of salt that was used as fake snow, so the salt was instead shoveled unbagged into the helicopters and flown into the studio and then shoveled straight out on the ground. Next, the Room 237 hag in the Japanese release. According to Joan, the Japanese release of The Shining featured an alteration to the naked hag in Room 237 that was so ridiculous that it had audiences laughing, and Kubrick was furious, although Joan didn't describe specifically what the alteration was. Interesting though that she had this story to tell. This suggests that Kubrick stayed in touch with her after the movie was released. That was unusual for Kubrick to do that. A lot of people have reported over the years that after working with Kubrick, when they'd finished with him, they would hardly ever hear from him again. Next, the destruction of props. Apparently several prop houses were refusing to rent any more props for use in The Shining because so many of them ended up broken during filming. Joan never stated whether the props were broken through carelessness or whether it was through being smashed on screen by Jack Nicholson. I don't know, she just mentioned that briefly. Next up, colour change in the Gold Room. The Gold Room was originally decorated in small silver tiles, as in the Silver Room, according to Joan, but after completion, Kubrick looked at it and asked that the whole thing be redone in gold. Can you imagine how furious the set decorators were? This ties in very neatly with my Kubrick's Gold Story analysis, in which I'd interpreted the film as being, in part, a commentary on the abandonment of the gold standard in the US monetary system. The US Constitution specifically stated that only gold and silver were to be used as currency, but under the Federal Reserve banking system, the precious metal-based dollar currency was gradually replaced by a fiat monetary system, which is money created out of nothing by the mere act of printing it or typing it into a computer. And lastly, the River of Blood miniature set. According to Joan Smith, this set was about 6 feet high and 11,000 gallons of fake blood were used, but she didn't see any takes being shot. I'd previously spoken to one of the curators at the Stanley Kubrick archives who stated something similar about the size of the set. After Joan Honor Smith finished her work for Stanley Kubrick, he added her name to his little black book of approved contacts for recommendation to other filmmakers. A short while later, she found herself working at the exact same studio doing work for Steven Spielberg on Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Well of the Souls set, or Snake Pit scene in Raiders Lost Ark, that was filmed in the same sound studio as The Shining's Colorado Lounge set, and it was done shortly after Kubrick's film wrapped. Due to the damage caused by a huge fire on Kubrick's set, the sound studio height was increased to facilitate the Well of the Souls set. Although I've not spoken to Joe Turkel myself, he's the actor who played Lloyd the bartender, and he was the only actor to have played parts in 3 separate Kubrick films, The Killing, Paths of Glory and The Shining. Although I haven't spoken to him personally, I have seen a couple of short interviews on YouTube that Joe Turkel has given in recent years. In one of them, he described that Kubrick was the greatest film director of all time, because he paid attention to every single minute detail that went into every shot of his films. And this is the guy who worked on 3 films with Kubrick. I've also received emails from 2 separate fans of my work who both happened to meet Mr. Turkel and had asked him about his experience of The Shining. The first correspondent was Hank Mayo, a storyboard artist who has worked in Los Angeles for nearly 30 years. Hank emailed me in 2011. He said that he discussed my analysis of Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey with Joe Turkel. My analysis is on my website in text form. It was back then and it still is. And he stated in his email, quote, "Last year I had a long conversation with Joe Turkel and he found your analysis of 2001 very, very interesting. He refused to absolutely confirm it, but he claimed that Kubrick had implied as much to him." End quote. Joe Turkel's statement to Hank implies that at some point, most likely during production of The Shining, he had inquired with Kubrick about the meanings of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Hank Mayo also described to me regarding his own experience of filmmaking that, quote, "Every complex director I ever met tested me to see if I understood layered symbolism. None lectured me on it, all aboard exposition." End quote. The second correspondent was Joseph Nardi, who I still chat with a lot on Facebook today. He gives me a lot of feedback about my work. He chatted at length with Joe Turkel in late 2013, and he gave me a very detailed report of their discussion, much of which aligns with elements of my published interpretations of The Shining. Joe's account of Turkel's comments were as follows. Turkel was on the production for 6 weeks. Kubrick spent almost a week of what was supposed to be shooting in the Gold Room just setting up shots with his viewfinder and making decisions on where to set up lights and camera equipment. Kubrick would often make subtle changes to the furniture in between takes. This goes for some of the bar chairs in the room during the shooting of the first scene between he and Lloyd. He would do it quickly and while speaking, as if to misdirect the crew as to why he was doing it. Turkel reasoned that he, Kubrick, was very secretive about why he made any subtle changes quickly and in between takes. Kubrick was upset that the ashtray props in the room were from the 1940s, and he made sure to get the correct props that were from the 1920s. When asked why it mattered no one ever see them up close, or what year they were from, Kubrick said, "It doesn't matter, I'll know." The first scene where Jack meets Lloyd for a drink had so many takes and took so long that Nicholson got fed up and began adding his own lines without consulting Kubrick first. He began with a foul routine about asking Lloyd if he's been laid and how he just got laid, so on and so forth. Turkel said he carefully watched Kubrick's reaction to this when he was off camera, and he noticed him shaking his head behind the monitor. Afterwards, he walked up to both of them and acted as if nothing happened, thus showing Jack Nicholson that he had endless patience and nothing the actor could do would stop his persistence at getting the takes he needed. Nicholson gave up after that and just stuck to the script. He did not improvise again without asking Kubrick first. The band in the 1920s Gold Room scene playing Midnight, the Stars and You, they were just extras acting like they were strumming instruments. When Kubrick found this out, he was enraged and fired the extras. He then went and rehired real musicians, the best that he could find in London at the time, and paid them to sit there and fake the playing of the instruments. One of Kubrick's daughters is in the Gold Room party sequence as a party guest or extra. She is seated 2 over from Jack's left and turns to watch him as he leaves the bar and when he drops his drink when Grady bumps into him. She continues to watch him as he leaves for the washroom. Turkel says that Kubrick was very insistent about the part being his own daughter and where she sat and what she did. I found this information to be compelling. I went back and watched the scene and action-wise it plays true, although I still do not know which daughter of Kubrick's is playing in that scene. Some takes had Jack drinking real alcohol and others didn't. Turkel couldn't remember which ones exactly, but there was a change in how and why they did this, and it did not appear to be random according to Turkel. My own suspicion about that is that Kubrick wanted to get Nicholson a little bit drunk for some of the takes so that he would appear drunk in the film, and that's one of the sort of hidden aspects of the film that I've talked about in my own analysis of it. The idea that Jack Torrance isn't actually possessed by the hotel or any particular ghost in the story, but rather that he's simply drunk. He managed to somehow get booze into the hotel even though he wasn't supposed to have them there, and he's not possessed, he's just drunk. Next up, apparently Turkel stated that the red jacket that Jack wears is supposed to be similar in style and colour to what Lloyd wears, which is why some may come to the conclusion that Jack is really talking to himself in those scenes. I'll also add my own observation to that. In a previous film that Jack Nicholson did called 5 Easy Pieces, in which he played the sort of psychologically abusive boyfriend of a girl, the outfit that Nicholson had in that film is pretty much ported over into The Shining. Same colour jacket, same jeans and same boots. It's very, very similar. Watch the two movies and the similarity is striking. Turkel also apparently said that Shelley Duvall was never the same after the shoot, and that while Kubrick never yelled at anyone, he did become angry and sometimes raised his voice, but mostly remained calm, even when telling somebody off. But he treated Duvall the worst of anyone in the cast or crew. But Turkel also noted that he treated Danny Lloyd the best. And finally, apparently Turkel also said that Scatman Crothers misread one line in a scene, and Kubrick became very insistent that he performed the lines exactly as they were written in the screenplay pages. Exactly word for word was what he stressed. So that's pretty much it for this video, just a whole load of background information. Not a lot of interpretation from me on this. Most of this is just reporting stuff that I've received from other people. So a big special thanks to Joan Honor Smith, Hank Mayo, and Joseph Nardi for the Joe Turkel information. Without those people being willing to speak to me or come and report things to me, this video wouldn't have been possible. So I hope this all gives you a nice little bit of background about The Shining, how it was made. I'm sure you can come up with your own ideas about what all of this means, if anything. You've been listening to Rob Ager. If you want to know more about The Shining, then do check out my very extensive 21 chapter analysis of The Shining on my website. That's in text form. You can go and check that out. I've got various other videos on The Shining here on my YouTube channel and on my downloads page on my site. All the links are in the video description below. Also, you can support me on Patreon as well. And don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Twitter, because I often give little updates via Facebook and Twitter that I don't give via YouTube and so on. Thanks for watching, folks. Bye-bye.